Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. This is great. My name is Maggie O'Grady, and I'm a sophomore here at MIT and a member of the student group Fossil Free MIT. On behalf of the group, I'd like to thank everybody here for coming out, and thank you for sharing your time with us. So we're here today because there are important decisions to be made by all of us together as a community. Is MIT going to lead against climate change? If so, what is our best strategy? Could divestment from fossil fuel companies possibly be the answer? A recent study by the University of Oxford defines divestment as a socially motivated activity of private wealth owners, either individuals or groups such as university endowments, to withhold their capital from companies seen to be engaged in reprehensible activity. This can include tobacco, munitions, corporations in apartheid South Africa have all been subject to divestment campaigns in the 20th century, and MIT itself actually divested from the Sudanese government during the Darfur crisis in 2007. Fossil Free MIT is a recognized student group made up of undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, faculty, staff, and alumni, all concerned about the real and present dangers of climate change. Members of Fossil Free MIT are asking the institution to divest the currently undisclosed fraction of its $11 billion endowment from the fossil fuel industry. So as of today, more than 2,120 MIT members have signed the petition. This number includes about a quarter of all undergrads, nearly 40% of the freshman class, and more than 230 faculty and staff. For the past 2 months, the petition has grown by nearly 150 people per week. And we are not alone in our endeavors. Fossil Free MIT is part of an international climate movement that spans 546 campaigns around the globe. This includes almost 400 colleges and universities, as well as cities, states, religious institutions, and other organizations. Many of America's largest cities have already pledged to divest, and that includes Seattle, San Francisco, and Portland. And a bill to divest the pension fund of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is currently being considered in the state Senate. The MIT community's discussion on divestment is growing rapidly. Fossil Free MIT is in ongoing negotiations with MIT's Vice President, Kirk Colin-Brander. And as we speak, the Executive Committee of the MIT Corporation is gathering to decide whether to convene the ACSR, which is the Advisory Committee on Shareholder Responsibility, in response to the 2,100 MIT voices that are calling for divestment as of now. So we hope that today's discussion will allow the MIT community to learn more about the divestment campaign, to ask questions, and to discuss the importance of climate change action in an open and constructive forum. We'll first be hearing from our 4 panelists before opening up the discussion to you all. We really want this to be an active discussion, so please ask your questions, voice your concerns, ask difficult questions. We want to hear from you. If you'd like to tweet about the event, if any of you are on Twitter, you can do that using the hashtag FFPanel, which is up there. One last thing I'd like to mention is that the members of Fossil Free MIT will be available for questions immediately following the event. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Becky Romatowski, who is a graduate student in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering. She has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT, and she has a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's very involved in student life. She's a multi-sport athlete, a GRT, and a Graduate Student Council department representative, as well as the GSC Sustainability Subcommittee co-chair. So, Becky.
Thank you, Maggie. And also a big thanks to our 4 panelists who could be with us today. It is my pleasure to be the moderator, and I'll start by introducing the panelists. Our first panelist is Geoffrey Supran. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Material Science at MIT, an MIT Energy Initiative Fellow, and the Outreach Coordinator for Fossil Free MIT. As a member of the Climate Reality Leadership Corps, Geoffrey frequently delivers Al Gore's presentation on climate change, An Inconvenient Truth, to a diversity of audiences. Geoffrey's research on next-generation LEDs and solar cells based on nanoscale materials has been featured in Nature, Photonics, and Physical Review letters. Our next panelist is David Keith, who has worked near the interface between climate science, energy technology, and public policy for 25 years. He took first prize in Canada's National Physics Prize exam, won MIT's Prize for Excellence in Experimental Physics, and was listed as one of Time magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2009. David divides his time between Cambridge, where he is Gordon McKay Professor of Applied Physics in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and Professor of Public Policy in the Harvard Kennedy School, and Calgary, where he helps lead Carbon Engineering, a company developing technology to capture CO2 from ambient air. Our third panelist is Ann Kelly. She is the Director of Public Policy at Ceres, a nonprofit coalition of investors and companies which seeks to promote leadership and best practices in sustainability. She directs Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, known as BICEP, a coalition of 23 leading consumer-facing companies seeking to advocate for meaningful climate change and energy policy at the federal level. She is a registered lobbyist and is actively engaged on Capitol Hill on behalf of Ceres and BICEP member companies. Ann is an environmental lawyer with 20 years of experience in private and public sectors. She is a certified mediator and a founding partner in Boston-based and mediation firm Creative Resolutions. As a member of the adjunct faculty of Boston Law School, she has taught courses in environmental law and climate change. She serves on the board of the Environmental League of Massachusetts, co-chairing its Lawyers Committee. Our fourth panelist is Jason Jay. He is a lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Management and Director of Sustainability Initiative at MIT, at Sloan. The founder of the MIT Generation and the Greening MIT Community Engagement Campaign, Jason has consulted on leadership and development and organizational change for major international corporations and non-government organizations. His own research focuses on how people navigate the tensions inherent in the quest for sustainability as they simultaneously pursue their own self-interest and the flourishing of human and other life. Jay has conducted an ethnographic study of the Cambridge Energy Alliance and serves as a research partner and a facilitator for the EDF Climate Corps program and its network of companies. These panelists, of course, have some great credentials, and to start things off, I'm going to give each panelist 4 to 5 minutes to speak on what their view of divestment has, what their view on divestment as a component of dealing with climate changes, and why they are personally interested or involved in divestment.
I guess to describe where I come from in all of this, I'll just start right at the beginning. I grew up on the south coast of England, and really growing up, I never imagined that I would be somewhere like this, sitting on a panel, talking to all these smart people about climate change. I started playing golf when I was 2 years old, and for the first 10 or 15 years of my life, really, that was my trajectory. Prospects of a professional career in golf were what I was looking into. And it was only really at about the age of 15 that I made a dramatic change in direction. A number of things happened that we can talk about later if you like, and they really led me to realize that in a way that putting a ball in a hole with a stick never can, science unlocks an opportunity to make a permanent contribution, like however small, to mankind's progress. And the reason I start with this little story is not to brag, but to try to emphasize that I think that in many ways, despite us all taking very different roads to get here, to get to MIT, many, if not most of us, probably share in a common belief that, that science has the power and maybe the promise to make the world a better place, the betterment of humankind that MIT's mission statement codifies. And so it's with that mindset that I come here and end up on this panel, with the belief that MIT should divest its endowment from fossil fuels. Because it's hypocritical of an institution at the very forefront of climate science and renewable energy technology to at the same time be investing in the fossil fuel industry. This is an industry that is causing rather than curbing the climate crisis, an industry that last year spent $674 billion developing fossil fuel reserves that the scientific community has unanimously labeled unsafe to burn. That's because current fossil fuel reserves in the world are already 3 times greater than our carbon budget. That's the amount of carbon we can afford to burn to stay within the 2-degree global rising guardrail limit that almost every country on the planet has agreed to. This is an industry that last year spent $417 million lobbying and donating in Washington against legislation that could act against climate change. And this is an institution at the very heart of targeted and directed disinformation campaigns that sabotage our science, that confuse our public, and that slander our peers and our friends and our colleagues. This is an industry that undermines our very raison d'etre, the very promise of science that caused a 15-year-old kid with a funny English accent to put down a golf club and pick up a physics textbook because he thought that doing something real matters. Now, the problem is that politics and not technology is now the bottleneck in mitigating climate change, as sad as that is for an MIT audience to hear, I guess. But that's where divestment comes in. Because through the institution, you and I wield a megaphone to public opinion and an immense capacity to effect change. And we need to shout through that megaphone if we're ever going to inspire the electorate that will boldly demand real non-business-as-usual leadership, a shift in an energy revolution that will take our energy technologies, the things I work on day in, day out of the lab and into the real world. But it's not just like blind optimism here. I don't wake up with divestment tattooed on my forehead, you know. I worry about it every day, and I'll be the first to admit that addressing climate change is, you know, it's an understatement to say it's difficult. And Professor John Sterman, one of Dr. Jay's colleagues at Sloan, he often talks about the need for a meaningful climate change action movement to be on the scale, the audacity, and the strategy commensurate with the civil rights movement. Back there and back then, Martin Luther King said, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor popular nor politic, but one must take it anyway because it is right." Right now, today, in this room, MIT stands at the crossroads in history, a time that demands bold leadership and meaningful action commensurate with the scale of this opportunity, a time for standing up and for finding our moral courage and for asking, what can I do? I don't think divestment is the be-all and end-all, but it's a pretty good place to start. Thank you.
I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the divestment movement, and I'm absolutely thrilled with many of the students I've met through that movement. But let me start by stating what I think is sort of some of the basic problems with respect to what academics call the theory of change here. Just get them out on the table. Suppose all universities divested of fossil fuels, and that was all that happened. Just suppose that for the sake of argument. So I don't know the total endowment, but it's something under 1%, as far as I can tell, of the total fossil fuel investments. And the fossil fuel investments, of course, many of them are held by state-owned oil companies and not directly through the market anyway. And if there was divestment, it would get marginally a little bit harder to access capital for those companies. And so in order for them to keep being in the business of selling people the fuels that they still want, the cost of fuel would have to rise a very small kind of marginal amount. So written in that very narrow way, you'd say, if that's all that was happening, this is an extremely kind of weak lever to get a very tiny carbon tax. And that would be all that would happen. So why am I still in favor of divestment? Because I don't think that's all that will happen. I think there are lots of an unpredictable set of things that might happen from a social movement like this that is by far the most sort of active and excited social movement on this topic that I've seen in the 25 years or so I worked on this topic. But I think it's important to be clear-eyed about the fact that there is not a very tight link between what we are actually asking for when we ask for divestment and what we want to see, which is an energy transformation that drives us away from fossil towards non-fossil alternatives. And I think this movement is going to have to be very nimble to think hard about how to use the kind of political capital and traction that it gains to achieve the ultimate gain, and which are certainly not divestment per se. So I want to say a little bit about some of the kind of arguments and counter-arguments, and I'll go to more of them in questions. One argument is that what we should do is not divest, but encourage the companies to use their resources to invest in clean energy. So one of the things essentially that the Harvard president has said, and that some Harvard professors like Rob Stavins has said, is that no, the big investments actually come from the fossil fuel industry, and what we need is to have them redirect to do more low carbon energy. I am deeply skeptical about that. I think even a casual student of the history of technological change will see that it's very unusual that big companies that are tooled up to do one specific thing suddenly succeed in a different business. So I think if we get to, and who knows how long that will take, a world where we radically move away from fossil to non-fossil alternatives. I think there will be some fossil fuel companies that manage to make the switch successfully and survive, but I think most of them will not. And I think if you look at where the actual innovation and change is happening, a relatively small amount has happened in the big fossil fuel companies. And indeed, many of them have pulled back from early investments in that because that's simply not what they're good at. Those companies are doing a legal thing right now, a thing that actually, as of today, we need. If they cut off their production tomorrow, we'd have mass death. So we need this product right now. We'd like to use less of it and taper off. And I like to do that a lot faster than probably the average citizen. But what they're doing right now is legal, and they are, and their boards are tuned up to do a particular thing and do it well. You can ask them to do it a little better along the edges with a little less, water pollution or whatever. But for climate, where the issue is the product, not changes in the way the product is made, but especially for transportation fuels, the issue is the product and the fact that we want to stop using that product. I think it's kind of implausible to expect that those companies will be the drivers of innovation. People in the companies are a different story. And I'll get to that in a second. A related argument that people make against divestment is simply that universities shouldn't play politics. The university's job is to have debates like we're having now, to do research, and to teach. And that's it. I think that argument has weight. For me, it carries more weight than many of the others. I think university has to be careful about getting too politicized, or they lose their chance to kind of do the other functions. But nevertheless, I think there are places where universities should be active. And part of it, and actually a part which I think is much more important and harder for the university to change than divestment, is what research they do. This university might or might not divest from fossil fuels. If it does, it will basically make no direct difference to UC. It won't actually, to MIT, and it won't hurt MIT that much to do it. The hard thing is the large amounts of money that MIT takes from the fossil fuel industry to do fossil-directed research. That's the much harder one, where it's not easy to separate which part of that you'd want and not want. Some parts of that research that are involved in perhaps making little bits of the fossil industry a little cleaner you'd want, but broadly, the political capital and influence that research buys, partly through where the graduates go and through the kind of implicit endorsement that you get through that, is something that I think we don't want. But actually, making MIT stop that would be much harder than making them just simply divest their portfolio. I've been thinking a lot about what we can plausibly ask for in this movement beyond simply divestment, because I think it's possible that you'll get divestment, but the only purpose here, I think, is to build a strong social movement that can ask for other things, because divestment alone, it's very hard to see what direct effect it has. So you have to think hard about what else you can ask for. And I think one central thing we can ask for is to demand, and you could do that in various ways, this industry to stop lobbying to interfere with the democratic process of making hard decisions about how quickly we want to get out of fossil fuels. That is the central concern. So right now, we want those companies to keep doing fossil fuels in the way they do them and do a good job, but we do not want them to alter the political process to make it harder for us to make legitimate democratic decisions about how we want to run our energy system. And I think that is the central thing we can ask them to do. And I think there are good analogies to other products which we decide we're going to make legal in society, but we'd rather have less of. So I don't smoke, I've never smoked, but I don't think we should outlaw tobacco. But I do think we need to think, and we do think in a society, that we don't allow tobacco companies to say, lobby young school children explicitly to have more tobacco, or to lobby doctors to say that tobacco is healthy anymore. We've realized that's not what we want. And I think we need to do the same with the fossil fuel industry. We need to basically say there's a safe zone where for a while, and may go on for half a century, where you're producing a product that we as a society still need, but that's where it stops. You don't have a role in trying to subvert legitimate democratic debate about how we get out of using that product. Thank you.
David raised some really good questions I hope that you'll pick up on in your Q&A, particularly that last comment about the appropriateness of lobbying. I couldn't agree more, and I think there's ways to attack that in particular. And Geoffrey's remarks, I think you need to have for breakfast every morning, so I hope you're taping, because when he finished, I pretty much was ready to go at that point. I thought he pretty much wrapped it up. Are we taping? Can I ask that question?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask this to be a tweet-free zone just for a few minutes. Taping has its reasons, but there are certainly some off-the-record comments I think we have the benefit of sharing tonight. When I speak for myself, I will let you know, and when I'm speaking for Ceres, I will let you know that as well. Speaking on my own behalf, I just congratulate you for this effort. I'm a huge fan of the overall 350.org effort. Been in this movement a very long time. It is exceedingly difficult to break through. to be heard at all. And it was really a stroke of genius to initiate the divestment campaign. So I personally give it a very, very strong endorsement, and I sort of see it from a long trajectory of having been at this and seen many efforts come and go. Very briefly, Ceres originated in 1989, originally stood for the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies. Yes, also the Roman goddess of the harvest. Now we just go by Ceres. And it was founded, to the point, by folks who were actively involved in the apartheid movement. So first and foremost, one of my recommendations is to take a very good look at what worked and didn't work in that movement. And I can't recommend enough Bob Massey, who was one of the presidents of Ceres for many, many years. He lives right in Somerville. He's a great local resource. I put the question to him directly. Are there real analogies between this movement and the fossil fuel divestment and the South African apartheid movement? Are there lessons to be learned? Because it's very easy for skeptics of the movement to say, oh, it's completely different. So don't even go there. Bob actually wrote a tome on this topic called Loosing the Bonds in the 80s. And he said it's very similar, and there's tremendous lessons to be learned. Ceres, essentially, now I'll speak on behalf of the organization, promoted from the beginning the active engagement by investors in the companies they own. In the wake of Exxon Valdez in 1989, there was a startling sense that companies were getting away with really heinous acts, and that investors needed to be more active shareholders. So that's what we promote, is active engagement. So that's different from divestment. That's really about saying, we want to really understand what a company does. We want to look very carefully at their activities, at how our money's being spent. And there's a huge body of work I'm sure you're familiar with about active shareholder engagement versus how a lot of money is invested, which is passively. And there's a blog, right, active versus passive investment. So we have an investor network on climate risk that has over 100 investors with over 10 trillion assets under management. We're a nonprofit. We don't own any of those, but we do mobilize and direct those investor activities. So we're intensely interested in this question and in this movement, and our investors have brought resolutions around to the fossil fuel companies that they own. Most of those are through index funds with a variety of results on a variety of issues, from AIDS to various sustainable apparel questions to palm oil, and yes, around climate change. We also have we work with about 65 major companies on their sustainability journey, trying to get them to clean up their act, to really think more carefully about putting sustainability into the DNA of the company. And that'll be the end of my talking about Ceres, except to show you this, which our good friend Brian Bowen, who's in the audience, helped us to develop, which is a climate declaration that just declares tackling climate change is one of the greatest economic opportunities of the 21st century. A bunch of companies are signing. It's a gateway drug to get them involved in active policy engagement on the energy and climate front. David's comments, one thing leapt out at me as he was speaking. Divestment isn't the be-all and end-all. This has to be obviously a multi-pronged approach, multiple approaches by multiple players. And some of those players are working on the policy front at the state and the federal level. So I still think there is a place for that. And as a galvanizing, I think a way to think about divestment is really as a movement builder, as growing the tent, which is partly what this was. It's a fair question to ask, well, what will happen if we all divest? That question is not the way David posed it, I think was really constructive. It's sometimes posed as a trap. Well, what will happen? Who cares? The Chinese will just own all the fossil fuel companies. And I would really not fall into that trap, because many, many things will happen if, in fact, a major university like MIT made this decision to divest. So there's so many on-ramps to this conversation. I'll just throw that one out. I love the way Becky designed the panel, because none of us are going to talk very long. We're going to actually hear from you. I'll just say that because we work so closely with investors, Ceres has come up with has taken a very, very hard look at what many of those investors face as they try to think about the possibility of divesting. And I'm sure you've thought this through a bit. For major pension funds that have a fiduciary duty to their pension holders, who are nurses and teachers and police officers, they really have a fiduciary duty to get a 7.2% return on their investment. And so traditionally, they have been fond of investing in fossil fuel companies that have a guaranteed return. Some of them have come to us and said, help me here. What can I do? This is my responsibility. I've got retirees to think about, and yet we want to do this in a responsible way. So Even Bill McKibben would suggest this isn't going to happen overnight. There are many, many steps. And one of the first steps kind of reminds you of what you do if you're writing a relationship, right? We've all been in relationships, and I'm sure none of you would do it in a text. If you found you were with someone and it wasn't going well, there might be a first step where you say, I'm not sure this is working for me anymore. You might say, I'm not sure I can trust you. Some of your actions, some of your words aren't lining up. Can we go have coffee and talk about that? What we're suggesting for our investors is a little bit like confronting the fossil fuel companies and saying, your value has shifted, and this is, of course, you know where I'm going with this, the carbon asset risk, the fact that there's unburnable carbon in the ground as identified by HSBC in their recent report. Companies' value is in part based on assets that are in the ground that, of course, can never be burned if we are to really meet our international climate goals of keeping within that 2-degree margin. As prices shift, and with renewables coming on, many of them are already starting to be stranded. So a fair question is actually help us understand what is your actual value now. And by pressing that question, it causes some examination and an audit. Now, again, David raises a really good question about, well, are we asking all these folks to become renewable energy companies? It's a fair question to ask. What are we asking of them? That's a fair question. One thing we're saying is die.
Not the people, but the companies.
The companies. One question is to say, be honest about your true valuation and to hold up a mirror. I'm your investor, and you're telling me, and that can be a constructive conversation that might ultimately end in a breakup. But it's still a useful analysis and one that we're encouraging, along with encouraging investment in the right things, investment in renewables. We need a lot of investment in renewable energy. And also a movement away from passive investing, a move toward active shareholder engagement, a move on the demand side to really push the companies you own, even if it's, say, a retail brand like a Starbucks or a Staples, or the top 50 wind purchasers, which are online now. Tell them to buy more wind. Tell those companies in a positive way to really push that demand curve to increase our transition to a clean, renewable energy economy.
Gabriel asked me to be on this panel in 2 capacities. One is as my role as a faculty member at the Sloan School, thinking about sustainability and business strategy and how that might inform this question of divestment. But also with my hat as an alum. I was a PhD student here at the Sloan School from 2005 to 2010, and was very involved in efforts around energy, environment, and sustainability as a kind of student advocate and activist, and fell on my face several times. Made a few home runs. And Gabriel asked me to share some of those experiences and if there's any sort of insights or wisdom from that might inform this divestment campaign. My personal background, which I will not nearly be as eloquent about as Geoffrey was, and I am second and that I kind of was ready to just stand up, clap, and go home after your intro remarks. I was not I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, with a sense of, the environment is important. You can't grow up in Boulder without thinking that. But I was not a political person. In college, I was focused on, learning cool things and having a good time. And it wasn't until I was a master's student at Harvard during the ramp up to the Iraq War that I really started to think about what my obligations and roles were as a citizen. And went to the art supply store in Central Square and asked them how to make a protest sign and what I should buy, and they sort of laughed at me. They're like, "You're not supposed to buy stuff. You're supposed to dumpster dive for it." So I had to learn some of the basics of how to march in opposition to the war, and that was an experience of not being particularly successful. Right? We still marched off to enter Iraq with all the consequences that we've experienced. When I came to Sloan a few years later as a PhD student, the thing that was really salient to me was that the MIT Energy Initiative was getting off the ground. And this was going to be MIT's major foray into energy, environment, and climate issues. And at the same time, our campus was expanding and building new buildings. And there wasn't a whole lot of talk about sustainable energy as a guiding principle for the energy initiative, and there wasn't a whole lot of talk about how the campus would reflect our commitment to a progressive energy future. We were sort of building new buildings that were going to consume a lot more energy, and there wasn't really much connection between this energy agenda and were we walking the talk on campus. So, I put together this effort with a group of fellow graduate students to create a petition. The petition essentially asked the MIT Energy Initiative kind of Research Council to think about integrating sustainability as a basic guiding principle for the Energy Initiative, and to take the campus sustainability seriously. And we ended up having conversations with Kirk Kohler and Brander in the same way that you guys are, but we didn't build nearly the scale of conversation and movement that you guys have done. And I really join in sort of commending your success just from a tactical and strategic standpoint in being able to get more than 2,000 signatures and 25% of the freshman class. I mean, I think part of that is a generational difference that we're seeing younger people being more active and involved in these topics. And part of it's just skill, and part of it's having a very clear, defined ask. You want MIT to divest, and the more focused and clear your asks are, the easier it is to engage people, have the conversation, make it clear what you're asking for. At the same time, our efforts really fell on not deaf ears, but ears that were willing to listen to us and then sort of let it slide. And we very quickly lost momentum among students for that effort. And part of the feedback we started getting was that MIT students aren't necessarily the most politically motivated group of people. They're motivated to sort of roll up their sleeves and get to work and make things happen and invent stuff and build stuff. So the second attempt that we made was something called the MIT Generator, which really focused on getting students involved in hands-on projects to advance campus sustainability. So we had computer science students building, an interactive energy map of campus that showed you which buildings were consuming the most energy. There was a group that was interested in behavior change, and they put a digital camera on the roof of the Stata Center pointing at building 66, and emailed, which automatically emailed people when they had left their lights on all night, with a gentle reminder, and it led to a significant reduction in sort of overnight energy use. And that actually really galvanized people, and it got us in conversation with the administration, and that effort really helped to spur the creation of a Walk the Talk task force on the part of the Institute that examines campus sustainability. And they invited me to be the graduate student representative on that, and now I continue sitting on it as a faculty. And now, as we've sort of built momentum there, now we're building an Office of Sustainability with Julie Newman at the helm, which I think is the long fruition, right? So Julie was hired this year in 2013. We got started with that effort in 2006. So you want to think about time horizon, right? It's one of the challenges of student organizing, particularly those of you who are here for a 1- or 2-year master's program, to have the patience to know that you're contributing to the longer view. So those are sort of my thoughts of sort of my experience and kind of the biases and perspectives that I bring to this. Now, with respect to divestment, so how do I react when someone comes into my office saying, "Will you be one of our first faculty signatories on a divestment petition?" And I heard Geoffrey out, and I was very impressed with his British accent and sophistication, and I told him no, because yeah, but I told him no, and the reason was that I was very much the arguments actually that David made, which is I didn't think that divesting a small amount of money from fossil fuel companies was going to have any serious impact on their behavior, on their investments, on climate change, for exactly the reasons that both of you guys have articulated. Many of this is state-owned. I was consulting for BP when they had their alternative energy business growing, and I watched them divest from it the second they ran into operational trouble. I don't have very much faith in the large companies investing in renewable energies that are going to be fundamentally disruptive of their business. But then I started actually stepping back and saying, well, that's, I was very impressed by the thoughtfulness of folks who were involved in this and the data that they had marshaled. So I took a closer look and started reading about the South Africa divestment movement, and saw that really the importance of a divestment campaign is to create a political symbol. and to delegitimize the target of the divestment. So it wasn't that South Africa was going to miss the investments of these universities. It was that on the global stage, South Africa started being seen as a bad guy. And when you're seen as a bad guy, that starts to have these kind of catalytic, cascading effects of other people wanting to not do business with them, and it starts to affect people in their identity. Are we a good people? Are we a not a good people? And it emboldens, I think in this case, I think the theory of change is that divestment campaign could embolden regulators to say, look, these super carbon intensive forms of fossil fuel extraction, and by the way, I also don't think that a universal divestment of all fossil fuels is wise. There's plenty of good argument that natural gas might be a useful bridge fuel for a while. There's plenty of argument that we're going to need to taper this off gradually, but there is a small proportion of fossil fuel production, which is the most carbon intensive in the tar sands of Alberta and in coal production more broadly, that probably is worth targeting and emboldening regulators to somehow step in with either a price on carbon or a direct ban on further coal-fired power plants or whatever it is. And we're seeing some of that happen. So once I started to see that, okay, maybe there is a logical theory of change here, that warmed me up a little bit to this idea of the divestment campaign. And then I really started reflecting on one sort of pillar of the arguments that have been made for divestment. There's a link on the fossil-free site to the Harvard campaign where they use this acronym of SIMPLE, which is science, integrity, morality, politics, leadership, and economics. Each of those is a different argument for divestment. And I find personally the most compelling one to be the integrity one, which is the simple moral argument that if the Institute is taking a stand for progressive solutions to climate change, to also have our money going to work providing capital to carbon-intensive businesses it's somehow out of sync. It's somehow out of step. And I think that's part of a lot of what I hear motivating Geoffrey, and that really persuaded me as well. And I think that, but as I really start looking at that motivation, and so I did ultimately sign the petition, I think that it's important to recognize that that integrity argument, is one thing we're doing out of step with another thing that we're doing. It really is contingent on, does MIT actually have any systematic institutional commitment to fighting climate change? If we did, and we were invested in fossil fuel companies, then that would be a problem. But actually, MIT does not have any kind of systematic commitment to tackling climate change. MIT is not a coherent body of people. It's a bunch of different researchers and voices with very different stands on the issue, very different sources of funding for their research, very different targets of investment in the research, and we don't speak with a unitary voice, and we haven't chosen to. I would say that my biggest hope for this divestment campaign from an MIT standpoint is that it actually starts a conversation about whether, as an institute, we want to take some kind of a stand for solving climate change. And whether that happens, whether we enact that stand through divesting our endowment, frankly, I don't particularly care. But I think that what we need to do is start the conversation. And I think we need to start the conversation about a systematic commitment. If MIT makes some kind of systematic commitment with some people kicking and screaming along the way to solving climate change, then a lot of things are going to start to become in play. Who do we take money from? What's the relative allocation of our education and research activities? Where is our endowment invested, and so on? But I think the first and foremost question is, are we taking a stand on an issue with strong scientific merit as a scientific institution? And David asked the question, should universities play politics? And I don't actually see this as playing politics. I see this as playing science. I see this as playing, we want to be committed to a future that we want to create, as opposed to the future that our research tells us that we know we're living into, and it's not particularly pretty. And so that's kind of my hope on the MIT stage. And I'll say more in response to further questions.
I'm very glad that Jason brought up sort of this morals and ethics. And so I think just to kind of maybe give people a chance to kind of respond on that and bring that, because a lot of times people in divestment think of like the monetary, like what happens, they think of investment. And we've talked a lot about like the theory of of change. And recently, President Rife wrote an op-ed piece where he wants, quote, MIT to be famous not only for its scientific and technical achievements, but also for how we treat people. And that, quote, MIT should strive to make our community one where all of us instinctively operate with the highest integrity and ethics too. As an institution, MIT has a notable history of taking the high road, and we must teach our students and remind each other why that is important and how it is done. So maybe we could have some of the other panelists answer this question about how MIT's investment practices should be factored into a discussion on morals and ethics at MIT, and if so, how, or if not, why not? And then we'll open it to the audience for questions.
So what's the date of that statement? Is that recent?
It's fairly recent, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, so that's a gift, right? You guys can just go to town with that, pretty much. I mean, enough said. I mean, Harvard has this, they have the shield that says Veritas, right? So truth. Handy. They've turned that shield into divestment. I did a little research to try to find ethics and morals in MIT's bylaws. I actually couldn't find any, but I know there's something there. But beyond that, there is another Ivy League institution that went through its trustee bylaws, and it found the kind of language that actually that letter reflects. And they used that just to build a legal argument before the Board of Trustees that said, going to Jason's very valid point about, hey, this is misalignment. Okay, this is what we said we're about, and this doesn't line up. So, a good lawyer did that, and that particular school actually was attempting to simply divest of coal, further to Jason's point, which is just, not to get tactical here. But I can't imagine anything better than that letter with that individual and this date for you to just, there's your campaign right there.
I think this is necessarily a moral question. I simply, and I've worked doing climate modeling for a long time, but the idea that there's a magic, sharp scientific answer and that answer dictates what we do is nonsense. It's sweeping all the hard problems under the rug. There is no magic 2-degree threshold. I know of no climate scientist who truly believes that. This is a constructed thing that climate scientists, and I know a lot of them who did it, thought was useful for political action, and it may or may not be useful for political action. There's no question that the more CO2 you put in the air, the more you raise the risk of climate change. No question about that at all. But the idea that there's some magic threshold where like 1.9 degrees is fine and 2.1 is bad, not supported by any science. And I think it's really crucial to see how important morality is in this game. This is about us not using our clean energy, our cheap energy, to pass on risk to our great-grandkids. It's very hard to see that in anything but moral terms. This is very different from other environmental problems where you can more simply see the self-interest. So it's also true that air pollution kills, still 50,000 people or so a year, premature mortality in this country. And you can have direct self-interest arguments to generations now living, us, why we ought to clean up. But that argument is quite different for climate change. Because of the very long time constants of carbon in the system, the fundamental argument, I think the only argument that really makes sense, is one that inevitably involves morality, which is how we think about the value of future generations and of having the natural world more like it is. And I think the idea that you can abstract that away and say you just have this magic piece of science, it violates the thing you get in Philosophy 101. You just don't go from fact to values like that. And I think it's one of the great things about this movement is that people are becoming more clear-eyed about speaking frankly about the moral questions involved.
The question is, if we're going to talk about integrity and hypocrisy, how about all of our hypocrisy, right? How about the fact that all of us are completely dependent on fossil fuels for the things that we live and enjoy, right? You could not have said it better myself. One of the things that I've been working on actually as a course of research and teaching right now is about how do we have authentic conversations with people about sustainability issues. And when I say authentic, what I mean is how do we be true to our inner conflicts and tensions and ambiguities around this, right? The fact that we all want to live comfortably and all enjoy the privileges that fossil fuels give us, and we're totally worried about future generations, right? How do we deal with the fact that, we want to stand out and be sort of self-righteous for being kind of environmental advocates, And yet that totally cuts us off from being able to have constructive, useful conversations with people who have different beliefs from ours. I think that question of authenticity and integrity is fundamental to any effort to try to build a broader conversation and to try to build a movement around any of these issues. And I think it completely has to start with that place. The other big one is the science is certain, right? It's done. There's no uncertainty about climate change. That's also complete BS. There's uncertainty in all science. There's uncertainty in there's a confidence interval on every finding, and to say that there's not and to treat it like a religious belief prompts exactly the same kind of religious belief on the other side of the denier aisle. And to be authentic about, wow, I'm grappling with this uncertainty. I'm grappling with my own, everyday use of fossil fuels. And yet I'm still taking this action because I think that the risks are great enough for us to act. I think coming clean with all of that and being able to just say that to people and use that as a conversation starter is really, really critical. And I also completely agree with what you said about there's no sort of evildoer out there who doesn't want a future for their children, right, or grandchildren. So we have to start having conversations with a much wider array of people and way beyond the sort of choir of advocates for sustainability if we want to make any change. And I think that's one of the things that a conversation or a movement like this can accomplish if you're willing to take the personal risk, the sort of personal psychological risk of going out and having those kinds of tough conversations.
Yeah, if I could, I'm so happy you raised that straight out of the box. The movement in general has been criticized. One of my recommendations on my list was for you all to have a narrative that explained what Peter Senge raised the last time I spoke at MIT about 4 years ago, which was how much we're part of the problem and the solution at the same time, and really owning that. And who better than MIT to get this right? Jason articulated it really well. To have a narrative that explains the fact that you all are walking the talk in all of its dimensions. So what does that mean? I am seeing styrofoam cups over there on the table. We know the petroleum basis of those. Like, who better than MIT to figure out what is the equivalent of, to reference the civil rights movement that Geoffrey noted, what's the equivalent of the bus boycott, right? So what do you do? Now, they didn't boycott the bus because of diesel fumes. We all know that. But I've thought about this, and one of the reasons that this gets to the seriousness of the movement, and one of the reasons that I have heard from college trustees who, let's face it, they're boomers, okay, so most are over 58, and anyone over 58 has a visceral connection to the protests of the Vietnam War, whether they were involved or not. I mean, I remember my parents deeply involved. My mom one day said, "Honey, we're going to pick up Jane Fonda at the airport." And I said, "Who's Jane Fonda?" I said, "Oh, she's an actress. She's coming to Detroit to protest, and your sister's going to nurse her baby." I kid you not. That's probably a TMI, but that's what happened, okay? That was my life, and my parents digging bomb craters, and we knew a woman who went down to the Civil Rights Act. My dad took care of her dog because he had a veterinary hospital. She never came back. She was the first white woman killed in the Mississippi. Those trustees want to see a real movement, and one of them has told me this directly. It's like, really? This is a movement? Unfortunately, millennials have been cast unfairly in many ways as being clicktivists, not activists. Is it real? It raises the question of, are they really willing to suffer? That's the question that's being asked. I knew we'd get to this point, and thank you for raising it so early. So who better than MIT to develop that narrative that has real action? Now, what does it mean? Does it mean we all unplug for a day? Because you all are pretty plugged in. You're sucking up a lot of energy this generation. Let's just be honest. We all are, right? Does it mean a no-fly zone? You're so right to raise. You went right to the Achilles heel with all of our carbon footprint on air traffic. It doesn't get talked about. Guess what? We know the numbers, right? So I look forward to the way you are going to tackle this question, because the trustees should ask it. And when Bill McKibben did the Do the Math tour, what frustrated our investors the most was saying, what? Who are these kids? Are flying from all over the world to go to the Do the Math tour to talk about fossil fuel divestment? I mean, people saw right through that. And I won't go any further. It's such a huge topic. We could spend the whole evening answering that vital question, and I thank you for raising it.
I want to make one major point, but first a minor one to agree. We will not solve this problem by consuming less, because you have to consume zero. We need to bring emissions to zero. We'll solve this problem by changing the way we make energy. And it is completely rational and self-consistent to not eliminate your own consumption, and also to vote in a democracy to impose some even-handed system like prices or regulations that make it illegal to use the atmosphere as a waste dump. Those are not inconsistent and it's not irrational. But the big one I wanted to say was about demonization. And it sort of links to the Vietnam War movement. It's my biggest concern about this movement, which overall I am thrilled with. And that is to be careful about not painting the fossil fuel industry, and especially the people in it, as the bad guys. So if I think about the biggest mistake that I believe happened in the Vietnam War, one that we still live with, it was relatively wealthy, relatively liberal people in elite places like this shouting at and demonizing young, disenfranchised, poorer people from the middle of the country who were actually fighting the war. And in any way, shouting baby killer and so on. And that had an enormous political impact. I think one of the reasons why America has been in too many wars in my sort of political lifetime is that it's extremely hard in America nowadays to be anti-war and not sound like you're anti the people in the war. And so I live in a town that makes its money entirely by fossil fuels. All my kids' friends are, all my neighbors are mostly in that business. And I am painfully aware that if we do what I want to do, it will be crushing. There will be suicides. People will walk away from their homes, leaving the keys like they did in the early 80s. They will bulldoze that town. That's a town I love. That is the reality of the kind of change we're talking about, and you have to be honest about it. And the people working in those industries, my friends in Calgary, who I go mountain climbing with and stuff, they are no less moral or good people than you guys at MIT. So it's really important to be clear-eyed about this. This is a business which powers the world, which for some parts of the world we want more of, for the poorest billion, and it is not a business that's populated by bad guys. But it's still true that I don't think it's a business that I want to transform by shareholder activism. It's a business I want to end. But you got to be clear about whether you're talking about the businesses or the people. And I think if this business ends up demonizing the people, it has real risks of running into a political quicksand. You do not want to have a bunch of smart folks at MIT looking like they're pissing on poor coal miners in Virginia. That will get you nowhere.
One quick solution on a bright note that is part of some of the legislative packages, believe it or not, that are being talked about in bipartisan settings. I just want to touch on the coal families in particular. There aren't that many left. We could buy them out. I'm sorry, Geoffrey, were you going to jump in? No, I just wanted to say that there are remedies around solutions where we bought out the tobacco farmers years ago, and I just, so there are ways to actually address this, in particular with some of the coal miners and families who are not treated well by the industry itself.
Yeah, so obviously, like everyone said, I have a list of sort of thoughts for possible questions, and obviously that was number one. I would be the first to say, like we've all said, we are all as a function of this system of the infrastructure and design entirely complicit, right? We all use fossil fuels every day, of course. But I would argue that that is more of a failure of the system than of ourselves. There's a professor at MIT, his name's Tim Gutowski, and recently he and his class, they calculated the carbon footprint of a homeless man, an American homeless man living on the street, surviving at a soup kitchen. His carbon footprint was 8 tons per year. That's more than double the world average, or about double the world's average. When you look at a case like that, it's pretty clear that an infrastructural failure has little to do with personal virtue, as people on the panel have indicated. I was at a Divest Harvard forum, a bit like this, just a few weeks or a few months ago, and Harvard professor Jim Engel, he talked a little about this, and he said, do what you can, do whatever you can. He said, yes, we're all guilty, but don't be the most guilty. My argument would be, at a place like MIT, okay, we're all lying in the gutter, everyone in the world, we're all lying in the gutter, but what's so wrong with a few of us keeping our eyes up on the stars? Surely us, if anyone in the world, it's up to us to take the leap and to take the risks that the rest of the panel have talked about, and to come back to what Jason was saying about whether we have a mission here at MIT. I agree, like I've been looking hard. I don't think that there is I don't think we have a constitution against climate change here at MIT, but we do, like I said, have a mission statement. It's mit.edu/mission statement or something. And it talks about the betterment for mankind. It talks about a better world for the nation and for the 21st century. And I think that if there's anyone in the world who's going to take that risk, it has to be MIT first. Going back to the newspaper clipping from the president, he said MIT has this history of taking the high road. But we didn't divest from apartheid-ridden South Africa. 150 other universities around the country did, and we stood still while they took action. And I think it can't be like that this time. So thanks.
The question is, how does divestment or then using the money for something else change things? We won't make deep cuts in CO2 emissions unless we have laws that restrict the use of the atmosphere as a free waste dump and that therefore encourage low carbon energy to win. That in the end, that's got to be the goal. The question is this a useful path along the goal, to that goal?
Obviously, a price on carbon is what we need and a tax on carbon, but as in this case, as in all cases, the law is the lagging indicator. It's the late comer, as it was obviously profoundly in civil rights. The leading indicator, it seems to me, are industries like solar, which is just going like gangbusters. Ceres has actually put out an investment strategy around reinvestment, and I'm happy to share it. I mean, it obviously looks very carefully at investing in renewable energy in all forms. We don't want to get into a complicated analysis about return, and that's really more Jason's area anyway, but you're absolutely right. I mean, so what we actually encourage more than divestment is looking very, very carefully at the returns you can get from long-term investment. An encouraging report came out today I'm happy to share with the group. You may have seen from CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. It includes 50 companies that have voluntarily, on their own, established an internal carbon price within the company. Microsoft, perhaps the most famous, and I know the woman who single-handedly put this through, and it's a 101 on how to do it. So there's lots of exciting things at the forefront to really push this further, knowing that, of course, given Washington, it's going to take us a while to get a carbon tax, for sure.
So you actually raised something that I hadn't thought about very directly, which is, let's say we've talked a bit about how if we divest from the fossil fuel companies, is anything really going to change in the fossil fuel companies? And the answer is probably no. Will it delegitimize the fossil fuel companies and embolden regulators to regulate it? Maybe, and that's part of the theory of change. But what you've raised, Graham, is this other piece of the puzzle, which is if we took the capital out of, now we don't know how much capital it is because we don't know the structure of the endowment. But if we took that capital that we do have in fossil fuel and very carbon-intensive fossil fuel, and we put it somewhere else, then we may actually that may actually be an avenue for a pretty significant impact. If it's investing in and actually providing capital to, commercialization of energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies, that could actually be a really nice thing to have happen. And maybe part of a progressive energy strategy, and I would encourage you guys as the fossil free to think about that. I just want to use this as an occasion to raise one other thing that's been kind of bugging me, which is that then the question that Anne raised is, well, okay, well, what would the return on investment look like from those renewable energy and efficiency investments compared to what you were getting from the fossil fuel, and does it make economic sense? And there's a economic argument that's being made around the edges of this fossil fuel divestment, which basically says, yes, that is the right thing to do because these are going to be stranded assets. The value of these companies is going to collapse. We should be in growth businesses. And so if you just wanted to manage the endowment from a financial standpoint and a fiduciary standpoint, that's exactly what you should do. I am very worried and skeptical and am going to be critical here of making an economic argument for divestment. And the reason is twofold. One is that I think it pollutes the moral argument. We have, there's a study, an experimental psychology study that we're working on right now at Sloan, the early results of which suggest that if you make a combined business self-interest argument and moral argument for a program or initiative, it undermines both. It makes people believe that there's actually less of both when you make the combined argument. Because we're not exactly sure what the mechanism of it, but something like, if you're having to give me two arguments, neither of them must be very good. And so if you just make the moral argument or you just make the economic argument, you might end up in a better term. So there's something to be said for clarity of argumentation around this. And the second piece is that I think the economic argument for the endowment and its fiduciary, return on investment and fiduciary responsibility, I think is fairly weak because it requires two pieces. One is, will these stocks actually lose their value? And two, will they lose their value before we're able to sell them off? And those are the two things that would have to happen if we were to actually lose money from fossil fuel companies. And the first one is predicated on there being a significant enough legislative action that actually the assets do become stranded. And none of us see that on the near-term horizon, although hopefully the divestment campaign results in that fact. But the second is much more important, which is, can we just sell the assets before the rest of the market sells the assets? And I think that's very likely. MIT's endowment is in smart money, right? And smart money will move the game, I think, and not respond to the game. And so the chance that we'll lose money on this, I don't see it as being particularly likely. Now, we did make some bad bets in the .com bubble when it burst. The endowment lost a lot of money, but that was predominantly because we were getting donations from alumni in the form of stock in their tech companies. And so the sell-off wasn't likely or imminent. So I think that I would avoid the economic argument in this case, except to say, there may be some issues here, and if divestment is successful at other places, that may end up hurting these stock prices. So maybe you should be considering environmental, social, and governance, or ESG risk in your portfolio. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to ask the endowment to do. But I think that is a completely different channel. It's a completely different approach. It's not a moral activism approach. It's we're here to help with the financial analytics to help you do that. It's much more of a Sloan School group of finance students there to help as consultants approach than it is a 2,000 petitions approach. So I think it's important to keep those things somewhat distinct.
I guess the first is, I'll try to address a few of the things that have been said. A recent report came out from Oxford University Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment, and it was basically a critical account of this divestment campaign in comparison to previous ones. And they found that in almost every case, divestment has led to restrictive legislation in one way or another, from the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act to the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act to stigmatization that leads to the price of a pack of cigarettes going from $1.75 in 1980 to $4.25 today. Divestment can work through its indirect effects. And MIT, by the way, knows that it can work, because remember that MIT has divested before from the genocide of Darfur. That's my first point. The second, I guess, is coming back to your question about kind of what happens with the money, how is it useful, and sort of what avenues can it be put into. I guess the first, I'd like to do a few kind of little experiments. So the first is sort of the money that is currently invested in fossil fuels versus money that we could be spending on sustainability on campus. So like Dr. J said, we don't know how much of our endowment is invested in fossil fuels because it's secret. But we can look at other case studies. So for example, University of Michigan, they have an endowment that is 38% lower than that of MIT's. But they have invested $1 billion in the fossil fuel industry. We know that because the students used their Freedom of Information Act rights to obtain that information. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that MIT has $1 billion invested in the fossil fuel industry. If you take that $1 billion and divide it by the $674 billion that the fossil fuel industry spent last year developing carbon reserves, you can calculate, this is very back of the envelope, this is a physicist talking, right? But you can calculate roughly MIT's contribution to carbon extraction. It comes out to about 10 megatons. So what's MIT's on-campus carbon footprint? It's about 0.2 megatons. So my point really, thank you, yeah. Yeah, so just to back up, MIT has a carbon footprint of 0.2 megatons, and it's funding the extraction of about 10 megatons. So the point is that by divesting, we can have an effective greening of the campus effect, an order of magnitude or two greater than the most comprehensive sustainability efforts. We would have to shut down the university many times over in order to have the effect that divestment could have. So that's divestment versus sustainability. My next thought is divestment versus renewables, investing in renewables research, for example. Last year, the US government spent $1.8 billion investing nationwide in renewables research. And remember, we're assuming that maybe we have $1 billion in fossil fuels. So if we were to take that money and reinvest it in renewables, we would be increasing governmental nationwide renewables research by more than 50%. And in my mind, that's a pretty good investment. The final aspect is regarding financial impacts on our endowment. We have this fiduciary responsibility to maintain the longevity of our endowment. And I guess I shouldn't really be going into the economic arguments, but I'm going to try. I'm not going to talk about the carbon bubble, because I think we've touched on that already. Rather, I'll think about the short-term impacts, the returns. And, you know, I'm not an economist, and it was Truman, right, who said, give me a one-handed economist, because mine keeps saying on the one hand this, on the one hand that. But I know of a couple, all the studies I've seen make me pretty optimistic. There's an index study group called S&P Capital IQ. They did an experiment where they took $1 billion, a hypothetical endowment, and 10 years ago, hypothetically, they invested it in the S&P 500 index. It's a standard trading index. And they did it in two ways. They either screened it for fossil fuels, the same fossil fuel companies we're asking to screen, or they didn't. The one that was screened went from 1 billion up to 2.26. That's the divestment one. The control went from 1 billion to 2.14. So the divested endowment yielded $119 million surplus compared to the control. Likewise, there's an investment management firm called Aperio. They did a similar study where they looked at the effect of screening on financial returns. They found that the tracking index, which is so cool, I don't know what it means, they found that the tracking index for fossil fuel screening was about 0.6%. But what I do know is that that translates into an incremental error of 0.01%. And that's on the back of an 18 to 20% standard deviation in the stock exchange. So what they concluded is, okay, you add 0.01% error to a 20% variation. So at least from a physicist perspective, that sounds all right to me.
The ramifications, if divestment spread and was successful, are potentially large. It buys a lot of political capital and strength that then can be used on other things, to force more wide divestment, to push for laws, to push for prohibitions against lobbying. If you were asking me what I would suggest that MIT do with companies that want to put money in from the fossil fuel industry, and by the way, it's not clear to me what the fossil fuel industry is, but it really isn't. But I would push against lobbying.
So the scale of the money is pretty significant. I mean, although you have to look at the broad flows. So if you look at the flows of money into and through MIT, you put it in sort of a a pie chart or something, right? It's the biggest chunk of money that comes into MIT is from the U.S. Department of Defense. Okay. The second is the U.S. Department of Energy. The third is the health-related funding that comes from health sciences-related funding that comes from the government, and then the NSF. And then I think tuition and corporate money are sort of down there a little bit lower. So, and then within the corporate money, right, how much money are we getting from fossil fuel companies to support research here? Well, I think it's actually pretty significant because just simply, if you look at the MIT Energy Initiative, which is the MIT-wide kind of effort to promote research on energy, it's a consortium of companies that has funded that. They've used that to leverage getting money from the DOE and the DOD on energy topics, but that is a major source of funding for energy here, and it's predominantly from fossil fuel companies. So BP, Eni, Shell, they've all invested. And I think the question of if we divest from those companies, is it going to piss them off and make them not give us research money, is a perfectly legitimate question. And if we're using that money to fund, Geoffrey's research, as he said, he's an MIT Energy Initiative fellow, then that is a risk that we need to be seriously considering. Because I think it's completely legitimate to take money from fossil fuel companies and invest it in renewable energy that's going to replace them. Actually, that's kind of what we need to do in our society as a whole, is take all this money that we've accumulated from sucking stuff up out of the ground and behaving unsustainably and use it to invest in stuff that we can use to live sustainably in the next millennium. So I think that's exactly what we need to be doing. But as a matter of practicality, a lot of that money does go to support the next generation of tar sands, engineering and petroleum engineering and so on, and it does create a kind of buy-in to those companies. And so we have to manage risk on both sides of that. I think it's a great question to raise. My funding did come from Eni, one of these founding companies of the Energy Initiative, and I feel that I'm putting it to great use right now. And in fact, our group meetings are often in a conference room sponsored by that company, so we revel in the irony, frankly. I guess what I would say would be,
Yeah, none of us know about whether a company like any might punish MIT basically for divesting. I happen to know a lot of people who work high up in the global energy sector. I should clarify, not from any, but other places. And I've heard directly from them that they don't invest in MIT because we invest in them. They invest in MIT because it looks pretty good for an oil company to fund solar cell research at MIT. And so I'm not sure whether we would lose funding or not, but it's a genuine concern, and it's probably one of my greatest, and I would fully admit that. I think my reason, nevertheless, for sitting up here with all that uncertainty and saying we should divest is that really it would be a great shame if a place like MIT knew it could do something against climate change and didn't because it felt financially hostage taken by the fossil fuel industry. Wouldn't that be a pretty tragic symbol of the societal failure that has led to the inaction and torpor around the world against climate change? I think that we, of all people, have to be better than the average. We can't say because other people stick to it, that's okay. As I said before, we have to lead.
Yeah, so the question is, we're saying fossil fuels. Should we be more narrow than that by saying only carbon-intensive fossil fuels? Should we be broader than that by saying other carbon-intensive industries like cement and aluminum and steel? Or is that just fossil fuels a simple enough message that it galvanizes people, organizes a campaign, and helps build political momentum? I'm totally with you. It was an ambivalence that I had when signing the petition that it's simplistic in that sense, but if the goal is to start a conversation and delegitimize a set of industries, everyone knows that it's about carbon and it's going to be the most carbon-intensive parts of the industry that are punished. So I think it's fine.
I think the simple answer is to have the divestment movement be just about divestment of fossil fuels, period, keep it simple. But that same group of people can also articulate what their long-term goal is. And that goal should also be, I think, deadly simple. Not a carbon tax, not any particular way to do it, not renewables versus nuclear, simply decarbonizing the energy system.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that, as far as I know, the fossil fuel industry is the only industry in the world that's allowed to pollute with its primary waste product for free. And as far as I know, it's also the only industry in the world that is at the root source of incredible disinformation that tries to undermine the very science that we stand for.
The cement industry, for example, is different. I mean, so I completely agree with your political science instincts, right? Just go for it. Because a trap will be, and people are going to set up a lot of traps for the movement, is, well, you're not being specific. Who do you mean? What do you mean? Don't go there. You need to charge ahead and then work on your FAQ on the side. Using one of the key criteria, though, remembering what Geoffrey just said, I mean, those who have lied, we're not talking about evil people, but there's a ton of misinformation out there.
So I just want to say thank you for having me here. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think the spirit of inquiry here is really important. This is people being self-critical while also being advocates. It's an incredible combination. I hope that continues as part of this whole conversation. I think that's our fundamental role, right? Is to know all the uncertainty and to know all the ambiguity and to know all the inner conflict and still to act. I think that's the most fundamental thing that MIT can do and the thing that will create the most sort of momentum behind our efforts.
Thank you, and thanks again for this invitation. A wonderful conversation. I hope we can have more of them. I hope it's the beginning of a conversation. I completely, I think what MIT needs to do is really about leadership, and it's completely captured by the president's statement, as I said earlier. I am surprised a little bit to hear the moral argument. I didn't think I would come to MIT and have Dr. J make the moral argument. Is it moral, is it scientific, is it economic? I'll just say I agree with you on the one argument. Ceres only makes an economic argument. We stay very, very far from the moral argument. On the other hand, you all, as students making the moral argument, gives you access not only to talk about value, but values. And so it's a much broader, richer narrative. And I agree with your having that articulated as a narrative. At the same time, I think the Sloan School is an incredible resource, and I do think that looking at some of the numbers, I'm familiar with the study that Geoffrey noted, Generation Investment, Al Gore's investment firm, is entirely fossil fuel free. I do think that having the analytical backup for their argument that comes out of the school, because you all could, of course, do that. I have been telling Geoffrey, I think that's an incredible resource to have, just so that you have your answers ready. So good luck to you all.
I think I would argue for simplicity, but not being simplistic. And I think that's where this movement is doing a lot of things right. I think you need a very, very simple ask, and I think that the ask you've got is good. You could think of other asks, but it's a good one. And then you need not to be simplistic, and I think you need to be very careful about not saying stuff that's naive and self-serving. So just to pick up on what we just heard, the reason that the reason that a bunch of renewable energy companies have made money is because of government policies that pump money in, not because they're necessarily smart or not because their investors were smart, but we have governments around the world putting right now about 200 billion of incentives to drive that industry. That's how people made money. And what we need to be clear about in this movement, I think, is not to get into the details of exactly how to do that, because there are lots of ways in which I think that's been grossly misdone. About 150 billion a year globally on solar with very little to show for it for reduced emissions. What you want to do is be deadly simple about what the goal is, which is to bring global carbon emissions to zero. And it's the goal of a powerful social movement to not, I think, get into the details, but to argue that that is the goal, and what you want is your legislators to legislate to make that happen.
I think to end, I'd like to just go back to the moral argument, because that's what brought me to this in the first place. Right now, here at MIT, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're fighting climate change with one hand, me personally in the lab every day, and we're feeding it with the other through our investments. We are investing in a changing climate that preferentially afflicts those least to blame, our poor and our unborn, people we'll probably never meet, for want not of solutions, but of courage in the face of our greed. And so I think it's probably appropriate that I end on an Einstein quote. It's about time. Einstein said, "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act." At MIT, we know plenty, and it's time to act, and it's time to lead, and I think it's time to divest.